Hello, welcome to another video, and today we're going to look at 10 different exercises that improve mobility of joints and the body and simultaneously working on stability of various joints within the body. So obviously these exercises have something very unique about them that allows you to work on often what we're doing separately. So let's have a look at this first one, being the forward ball roll. Quite a simple exercise. Most people are quite aware of it as an abdominal exercise, but it's actually a lot more than that. There's a lot more things going on with this than many people realise. So if we break it down for you, so this first part where Dylan, I'll let it play for you for a minute, just get an idea of it. So the stability component obviously very hones in around the core, everything in the abdominal region and the pelvis, but it's really being dictated by how much mobility may be present in the hips. So you can see Dylan a little bit stiff through the hip here, not quite sort of opening out, and also through the lats. So the lats really running from really from there. So these two areas, and probably the third part would be thoracic extension. So these three areas are really having to mobilize themselves for the shoulder to get into full extension, for the rib cage to also get into extension, and for the hip to get into extension. So everything's got to line right up. And obviously then the stability component gets really honed in on the core. There's not so much on the shoulders and definitely nothing in the knees, but it's quite a deceptive exercise in that many people only think of it as a stability exercise, but really the stability can't be achieved if the mobility is not there first. So obviously I could work on separate stretches and that to try and improve the mobility, but may do very little in improving it by itself. That's where I may get more benefit from trying to learn how to engage and get the mobility within the stability component. Sometimes the stiffness might be a reaction to the weakness, so that's where you could stretch them and they have great flexibility, but they don't have it in the forward ball roll. All right, so that'd be one sort of very simple exercise. Now if I look at the hips, and I've done videos on this before, but this is just to explain how this would be here. It'd be like a 90 stretch. So this would be a hip stretch for the glutes. But when we do it as this hip switch movement, there's some, right at that point there, he needs some stability. If he doesn't have stability through his core, he will fall back and have to put his hands on the ground. So even though the mobility is the main priority in this particular one, the stability is a huge component of it in order for him to be able to sit upright like he is right there without his hands on the ground. All right, so again, probably as opposed to the forward ball roll that might have more stability focus with some mobility, this is more mobility focus with some stability. All right, now the next one that I will do is with the little hurdle drill, and this is probably going back to the forward ball roll type of scenario where we see more stability required than mobility. So this is where he's still going to have some component of his hip mobilizing right there. So if he doesn't have the ability to abduct the hip to lift it up high enough to clear the hurdle, so right at that point there, if he jams up in this spot here, he won't be able to do it, and it'll compromise his ability to stabilize. Simultaneously, if he doesn't stabilize, he'll still fall over even if he has the mobility. So you can see how he needs both things happening at the same time in order to execute the exercise. Just like we've seen with the other two, they just have a bit of a different focus. Sometimes the more mobility focus, other times it's stabilizing, but make no mistake, they really require both things doing exactly what they're meant to do in order to complete the exercise efficiently. All right, so the first three, so the first one probably a bit more of a core and thoracic extension. These last two definitely more hip loaded. The stability component there really driven by the glutes on this kneeling leg and opposing with the obliques on the other side, which was what we would see with a lot of single leg things, suitcase carries, a lot of issues with lateral pelvic tilts and stuff like that, which we'll also see later on with one of the other exercises. This next one is the inline lunge. Again, I've featured this many times. This sort of brings in the lunge movement, but with not much strength required, just pure stability. So moving from hands out to the side to hands behind the head creates a greater demand through the core and you can see these little reflex reactions that Dylan's having to make. So often these reactions through the core moving in this frontal plane are being driven by the hips being too stiff to sit on this nice straight line. So if the hips are free and moving easily, it's easier to engage the core to maintain an upright position. If the hips are trying to create the stability, then you end up getting this constant falling over to the side all the time. So again, not a lot of strength required to do this, just pure stability. Probably not even a lot of mobility, but it's a bit of a different type of mobility than what we saw with the other two. Alright, so we've got 4 exercises so far, so the next one we're going to move into a little bit more upper body focus. Again, this is probably where we see the thoracic being highlighted and the core a bit more, and this is the first time we'll see rotation. So this is where we get moving into like a push-up position, and you're just basically trying to rotate around with the thoracic rotation. Now, we've done this drill many times where we're kneeling on the ground and it's just mobility based. This one's a lot different because it has stability component. All right, so obviously that one arm really has to be quite stable, and this is where we get, so this is where you get full thoracic rotation. You get a little bit of help from the hips on this one, but this arm really has to be quite stable. So this is where you get good work, scapular stability, serratus anterior work, but you don't need as much strength as you would say with a push-up, for example, or a chest press. The strength requirement's quite minimal. It's just the stabilizer, especially that pushing out part there. And when he comes back around, right here is often where we'll see with issues with the shoulders, where they can't control they can't protract enough with the arm pushing the ground away, so the scapula sort of wings, and then they get all types of stiffness and trigger points. All right. Other times maybe they just don't have the ability to rotate around, and they might pause there. Might be all they can do when they really need to get there. All right. So this is quite a clever drill. Sort of shares some of the things that you require in the Turkish get-up, all right, which we'll see at the end. All right, but that's a nice little drill that you could use there. The yoga push-up is the next one. This is, again, probably a bit more strength element in this, but you could easily just start out just as the downward dog on its own. And you see here, Dylan's got like a bent knee approach because we've got like more of an upper body focus on this, so we're really trying to emphasize scapular sort of rotating out and around, and that big lat stretch that we spoke about with the forward ball roll before, and also the thoracic extension. So by him keeping his knees bent, it's fine, because if he straightened his knees out, we might compromise what we're wanting, which is for, say, neck or shoulder issues. If I wanted to make it about calf flexibility or hip mobility, I might force him to keep his knees straight. But neither of them are wrong. It just depends on what your focus is. All right, so I could just start out with the downward dogs. It's a great way to sort of get that scapular feeling. And then I could start building into the push-up, which is probably the first time I see a bit of strength required. And so I could go push-up into downward dog, or I'd go straight from push-up to downward dog. So there's no sort of in-between. You'll see on this next one, he'll go straight up into the downward dog. So as he lowers, now his hips will go straight towards the roof. And that helps us to really engage this overhead movement that we might be preparing his shoulders and neck for, because he may have had issues or weakness around those sort of particular movements. And this is a great way to regain control of the scapular and overhead movement, because you've got more control being a closed chain exercise. All right, so then we'll get up into more of our standing type of exercises now. So we'll have a look at the single leg one. This one's quite a tricky one, and there's a lot of moving parts in a lot of these leg-based ones. So probably, again, this is more stability focused than mobility. But by rotating around, we force a fair degree of hip rotation to loosen up. So a bit like what we saw earlier with the hurdle drill. If he doesn't have the mobility in that hip that's in the air, he won't be able to get around and probably feel it jamming himself up. And obviously the stability on the stance leg is really being enhanced. So it's the first time probably see foot stability brought into it, because it's the first time we're actually standing up. All right. So this is quite a great exercise for foot and hip. Obviously building tremendous strength into the glutes and even the core itself. All right. So great way. And you can see Dylan really struggling with this one, as does everyone. It's hard to get it perfect straight off the bat. But you can see how he's really testing himself to try and find the mobility, and when he does, he's got to learn how to control it. So he gets a couple of good ones here and there, but really difficult to do. I think he's probably better without his shoes on. I think for some people the shoes might disrupt their ability to control this particular movement. Right, but an excellent one that does have mainly a stability focus, but the mobility is definitely required. All right, so then we can come out of a single leg one and bring into like more of a lunge pattern again, and this is where we see the multi-directional lunge. So we get like a bit of a forward moving lunge, and then we get this diagonal one, so that trailing hip gets a bit of internal rotation. Then we get the adductors involved for the first time, so we get that side lunge. Hamstrings actually get a good workout on that. Now we get the other leg moving into internal rotation on the trailing leg. The front leg is more stability and strength based to try and control the alignment of the knee, the hip, the knee and the ankle. So this is a great one for working, really getting the hip to work in these internal and external rotation movements, getting adductor and hamstring length in there. Now it's probably a lot more anterior hip, really loosening everything up. So this is almost like a series of stretches with an element of strength added on top, the multi-lunge. So I probably try to think of it like that. The next one is probably arguably more strength exercises, but it's a great way to, if you're really trying to help someone free through their hips and improve their pattern of movement with squats and deadlifts. This is where you're working the squat and the deadlift at the same time. I probably would say there's not as much mobility as we've seen with the other ones on this one. It probably compromises a bit of the mobility, but for some people the depth is where the mobility is really being targeted here, especially on the squat. So you can see here on the squat here, the real emphasis on getting deep. So it's where he's really going to have great knee flexibility, but also incredible hip flexibility to get that low and the thoracic so that he can sit in these nice positions. All right, and then when he's coming up, so we're getting a lot of knee and ankle work there. Now we're getting the Romanian deadlift, where now we get primarily like a lot of hip mobility, so hamstrings, and really getting the hip to sit back. So we're really getting the person to understand the difference between a squat and a deadlift. So we're getting all three of the joints of the lower limbs, and then particularly in the squat here, probably the thoracic as well, but obviously a lot more leg-based movement. So this could be great for someone who's got incredible strength but doesn't quite have the mobility to get the range on either of these two movements, and we're sort of sacrificing strength to find lost range of motion and get mobility, but not at the expense of their being able to stabilise it. All right, so it's quite a clever exercise in its own right. Then the last one we'll look at is the Turkish get-up, and again I've featured this one so many times, and for very good reason. It's just such a great exercise. There's so many moving parts, there's so many things that need to work with incredible stability here. So even that part there is like incredible shoulder stability, not just with the dumbbell but the hand on the ground as it moves forward. Now there's sort of some element of glute strength right there on that stance leg, and obviously the moving the leg underneath, he needs incredible mobility. And then you've got that lunge movement at the end, but also with the dumbbell overhead there's thoracic mobility. So there's so many parts of the body that are having to be mobile, while simultaneously the opposing side has to be very stable, or else you can't stand up, or you get stuck in a point there. So it's almost like a series of yoga poses with a dumbbell added onto it. All right, so here comes the mobility part where he's got to sweep that leg under. So it's very similar to that hurdle drill and hip switch we saw earlier, and there's our overhead lunge. All right, so an overhead lunge in its own right is a tough stability and mobility exercise. I could have included that in this easily. All right, so that brings us to the end of our top 10 exercises. There's plenty of others I could include, but I tried to give you a bit of a variation of some upper body, some lower body, some that are more core based, but they all share those same sort of similar traits about them. There's something about the exercises that requires you to move through a full range of motion, but also be able to control it. All right, and this particular movement, when Dylan did it, we did all this in one take. This took about 5 minutes to do. He was extremely warmed up. This could be a really good warm-up routine for someone prior to a workout, and only takes 5 minutes. Everything's sort of immobilized, stabilized, and you've got some really good, you're a little bit puffed out and warm, but not exhausted. It could be a great way to incorporate this as a warm-up routine if you're competent at all of these movements. All right, so anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that video, and we'll see you next time.